I'm Glenn Campbell of Demographic Doom. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the surprising demographic crisis in Israel. It's something that outsiders would never have expected. And it concerns the Haredim, or the Ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel, who are essentially taking over the country with their huge population gains. They produce on average 6 to 7 children per woman, which is equivalent to a desperately poor country in Africa like Niger or Nigeria. This particular sect of Judaism is producing a huge number of children, and this is compromising Israeli politics, and it's compromising, in fact, the future of Israel. Now, people on the outside think of Israel as a place of conflict. They think of Arabs versus Israelis and Jews versus Muslims. You think of the Palestinian crisis. What you don't think of is the real crisis, which is Jew against Jew. And the real crisis in Israel is these ultra-Orthodox Jews versus all the other Jews. But before I get too much into it, I want to kind of give you a background of my own history with Israel. I have visited Israel 4 or 5 times between 2008 and 2011, when I could fly for free with an airline. Of the 87 countries that I've visited so far, Israel is one of the most fascinating, one of the most tantalizing and confusing countries I've ever been to. It's just not what you expect. Nothing you can read and nothing you can see on television prepares you for visiting Israel, because it is totally unexpected, a total clash of cultures. There's so many cultures within the confines of Israel that it's really hard to make sense of it all. And if you enjoy puzzles, enjoy mazes like I do, then Israel is the place to go, because everything about it is a puzzle. It is tempting to call Israel a melting pot of cultures, but that's not true. America is a melting pot of cultures where all different cultures come together and form one American culture. In Israel, all the cultures stay separate. And you can tell the difference between cultures by their headgear, by their hats. Israel is a place of many different hats. So you have different kinds of Jewish hats. You have yarmulkes, and you have the fancy fur hats. And then there are the Muslims. They have different kind of hats. And the Arabs have their own hats. And Christian clerics will have their hats. So you can tell the difference between at least the most extreme cultures just by looking at their hats. And the hats that stand out most of the Haredim, or the ultra-Orthodox. And they're all over Jerusalem. Everywhere you go, you see them. You also see women who aren't as outlandishly dressed, but they're all always dressed in black or dark colors. And they usually have a lot of children in tow. So Israel, or Jerusalem, is the only place I've been where you still see women with a lot of children in the street. In other countries of the world, you see a woman pushing a baby carriage with one baby, or maybe 2 babies. In Jerusalem, you'll see a woman with 4 or 5 babies, 4 or 5 children in tow. And those are the Haredim, producing babies to carry on their way of life. And their way of life is truly bizarre from the outside. The men in this culture don't work. They just study the Torah all day in yeshivas. Their whole purpose in life is to study the Torah, which to Christians is the first 5 books of the Bible. And all wisdom in life supposedly comes from the Torah. The women do all the work. They raise the children, and if anyone works at a job, it will be the woman who works at a job to support the family. So it's a bizarre, really, a bizarre culture. And the only reason it does exist is because of welfare payments from the Israeli state. So for each baby that this family has, they get welfare support from the state, which allows them to have 6 or 7 children, and all those children survive. And at the beginning, in the founding of Israel, there were only a very limited number of this sect around. But because they keep having lots of families, they're growing and growing, and it's getting to the point where there's almost 1 million of them within this state of Israel, which isn't all that big. And they vote as a block. So they vote first of all, they vote. All of them who are capable of voting do vote, and they vote as a block in support of what their rabbis tell them to vote for. So this is extraordinarily dangerous to have any group voting as a block. And they're voting for the most bizarre things. They believe God has given them Israel so that they are entitled to the Palestinian territory. They vote that they want to vote to essentially turn Israel into a theocracy. And that's the real danger here. I'm going to play a little clip from a very good documentary, a very good CNN documentary that kind of captures the Haredim problem. The series is called Believer. And if you search YouTube for Believer and then Haredim, Haredim, you may be able to find this documentary.
Have you ever lost your country to extremists? To religious conservatives who've changed the very fabric of your society? I have. In 1979, my family was forced to flee Iran after a revolution transformed that country from a secular state to a religious one. Now I see a disturbing trend in Israel that reminds me of what I lived through back then. A fundamentalist, anti-modern religious minority that's growing at an alarming rate, entering into government and challenging the secular nature of the country. Will the Ultra-Orthodox Jews transform Israel into a religious state? Or will Israel's secular Jews be able to maintain the democratic promise of the country's founders?
So there's the problem. I only became aware of it a couple of weeks ago, but as soon as I did, I realized, oh my God, Israel is doomed. There is no way out of this other than complete disaster. Israel has survived all sorts of external threats. All of its neighbors would love to annihilate Israel. But it turns out that these external threats are not the thing that's going to do in Israel. It is this internal threat that is going to push all the secular Jews out and turn Israel into a theocratic state. Because you can't deny the numbers. If one group keeps producing 6 to 7 children every generation, in very short time you've completely populated the country with these people, and they push everyone out. They are enabled by the Israeli government, specifically the right-wing factions of the government, who want their votes, so they pander to them. So they do not cut their child subsidy, do not cut their welfare payments. And if you look at Israeli politics, to an outsider, it's confusing as hell. It becomes a little bit less confusing if you understand this pressure that the right-wing factions of the government are under. They need to appease the Haredim because they need their votes. And so they make all sorts of concessions to them. I don't want to get into the specifics of Israeli politics because it will have changed by the time you listen to this. But whenever you're listening to stories about Israel, you should think of what is the impact that the Haredim have had on this situation. So the Haredim benefit in 3 ways from the Israeli government. They get these welfare payments. They are supported by welfare. This is a very poor group, but their childbirths are funded by the Israeli government, and the Israeli government seems powerless to to control this, because how do you cut off aid to children? The other concession that the Israeli government has made to them is they allow this group to have their own schools called the yeshivas, where they teach their children as they choose to teach them. And that does not include the secular subjects of math and science and things like that. There's no core curriculum, no required core curriculum. They learn the Torah and nothing else. And, from my standpoint, from a Christian background, I look at the 5 first books of the Bible. That's not a lot. That's not a lot to study. Yet they study this full time for their entire educational careers. And they get support for this from the government. And the problem is that you're creating children who are uneducated in the ways of the world. They're without any math or science, or very little math or science. They're not prepared to man Israel's high-tech industries in the future. So Israel is being gradually beaten back down into a very primitive society that resembles a total theocracy. The other concession they get from the Israeli government is they do not have to serve in the Israeli military. And this is a big political flashpoint, because the Israeli military is a central part of Israeli life. It is a draft, just like America used to have during the Vietnam era. They're all young people. Not just young men, but young women are required to serve in the IDF, the military of Israel. And that's why Israel is a safe place to visit, because everywhere you go, you see the young men and young women with guns guarding places. And this is not only is this military service, but it's a sort of cultural thing where people become Israelis. Young people just sort of enter Israeli culture and become part of the whole by doing this military service, which is a great unifying factor in Israeli life. I approve of it. I think all countries should have that kind of national service. Most young people serve in the military. Young women also serve in the military, wearing the same uniforms as young men. The force is very integrated. Young women get an exemption from military service if they have babies, if they have children, which is entirely appropriate. You're doing your national service by having children. But the Haredim are exempt. As long as the Haredim are studying the Torah in their yeshivas, they are exempt from serving in the military. And this gets the rest of the Israelis who have served in the military very upset, because this one group isn't doing its part to support Israel. This one group is taking government resources and not paying any government resources in taxes because they're so poor, and they're not serving in the military, so they're not giving their own labor to support the Israeli state. So this is a huge conflict. I can't see any way that this is going to be resolved. The other conflict between secular and moderate Jews and the Haredim is the Haredim see themselves as the one true religion, the one true keepers of the religion. Their interpretation of the Torah is correct and everybody else's is wrong. And they see no problem wandering the streets, because they've got nothing else to do, trying to enforce their version of Judaism on everyone else. And this is apparent on Friday evenings. One of the biggest impressions on me of visiting Israel is what happens on Friday evenings. Friday evenings is the beginning of the Shabbat, or the Sabbath. In Judaism, the Sabbath lasts from dusk on Friday until dusk on Saturday, when you're supposed to close. It's just like Sunday in the Christian tradition, but it's much more extreme. In the central areas of Jerusalem, you're expected to close your shop right at at this certain time, right at dusk. And if you do not, these guys in the funny outfits, in the black hats and the black coats and the big beards, are going to come by and harass you. They're going to bang pots outside the door of your business if you do not close promptly at dusk on Friday. They have no authority from the government to do this. Their only authority is from God. And when they came to my hostel, they did the same thing in front of my hostel, which is a conventional Western style hostel in modern Jerusalem. And they come and they start yelling outside the hostel, Shabbat, Shabbat. And we inside, we foreigners inside think this is some kind of a joke, but the hostel manager says this is not a joke. These guys can cause serious problems. They can get very violent. So the hostel manager goes out to these guys. I have a photo of it. The hostel manager goes out to these guys and explains to them in Hebrew that there's no Jews here. This is a hotel. Only non-Jews stay here, so we are exempt from the Sabbath. So within Israel, the Arab businesses are exempt from Sabbath. So in Israel, you can't take a bus, you can't take public transit, but you can get a taxi from an Arab Israeli taxi driver. So we got off the hook for that. But you can see that this is very dangerous when you have one group. You have one group where the men don't work, where the men's only purpose in life is to enforce the Torah, enforce, for lack of a better name, Sharia law. And they don't work, they don't contribute to society, they don't pay taxes, but they produce a lot of offspring. They don't go into the military, but they do vote, and they vote as a bloc according to what their rabbis tell them. You can see where this is all headed, and demographically, it's very simple. At a certain point, these guys are going to become the majority. The majority of voters in Israel will be this Haredim, and they can impose anything they want on the rest of society. So that will be the end of Israel. It won't be hostilities with Iran or hostilities with other outside parties. It will be Israel destroying itself from within. And I can't see any way out of it except for perhaps an economic collapse. Just like America, the Israeli government is jacking up its government debt. It has huge government debt, which can only grow. And part of this government debt is funding the Haredim, funding the welfare payments for the Haredim. So you have all the working people in Israel, all the people who go to work and pay taxes and who come up with innovative technological ideas and who start businesses. They're all supporting the Haredim, the welfare payments for the Haredim, so the Haredim can grow and take over Israel and wipe everyone out. And that's truly what it is. It's wiping everybody out. Once these people achieve majority, they are going to impose their theocratic regime on everyone else. Everyone else will either be forced either to flee or to live under their rule. But if we have a big financial collapse before that, that's going to mix everything up. If suddenly the Israeli government can't fund its welfare payments anymore, or if the Israeli government just collapses under its own financial burdens, that's going to shake things up. It's not going to change the numbers much because children who are born are already born, but it may shake up the power base of the Haredim. So now that you know this and you hear news coming out of Israel, one recent news story is Netanyahu, the prime minister who at this time is fighting for his political career. He's promised to annex parts of the West Bank. And you say, what could possibly be the motivation for that? Well, it's red meat to the Haredim. He's doing this to try to entice the more conservative segments of politics to vote for him. So future news stories come out of Israel, you can analyze it this way. What does the Haredim want, and how is the government trying to pander to the Haredim?